Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ray, and welcome to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. In this podcast, we'll keep you up to date with the latest app development tech talk. Now, here are your hosts, Drew Freeman and Alex Sullivan.
Thanks, Ray. This is the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Welcome to episode 3 for season 10. This episode was recorded very early on Saturday, the 7th of March, for release on the 25th of March, 2020. This episode is sponsored by Springboard. I am Alex Sullivan, here with my bearderific co-host, Drew Freeman.
Thanks, Alex. On this episode, we welcome Shai Mishali to the show. Shai is the author and the final pass editor on the book Combine, Asynchronous Programming Swift from RayWenderlich.com Press. Shai is the iOS tech lead at Get, the on-demand mobility company. He's also active on open source projects such as the RX Swift community and RX Swift.
On this episode, Shai will take a synchronous approach to telling us about asynchronous programming with one of Apple's newest frameworks, Combine. Shai, welcome to the show.
Hey there, thanks for having me. Awesome being here and talking to you about Combine today.
Yeah, which now I guess we should we'll get to this later, but it's Combine, it's not Combine, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's pretty funny because people were a bit confused about how to pronounce it, and we actually couldn't find the logo for all of our open source work, so we just used the tractor icon, which is like Combine, just to kind of confuse everyone, but it's indeed Combine because you combine things together.
That makes sense.
That's amazing. Has that stuck? Is the tractor icon a thing?
The tractor icon
open source projects around Combine?
The tractor icon is definitely a thing in Combine community and some of the other projects I'll talk to you about later. I believe, but I think people mainly laugh at it because they understand the joke. I really hope no one takes it seriously and thinks we are open sourcing tractor software or anything. Not our plan anytime soon.
That's amazing.
Which is why they went with a polar bear for the book.
Exactly. This was actually my wife's idea, and I think it's awesome. We had a big discussion in the Ray Wenderlich team if a polar bear is considered a sea creature. And I convinced them that it indeed does. I'm very happy with that.
That feels like a bit of a reach, but I'm on board.
So a sea bear.
Yeah, I mean, the scientific name is something related to aquatic waters or whatever, but I just wanted a cute little polar bear on the cover, and no one else used that creature for the book cover, so it was not... And every time I get to talk at some conference or talk about the book, people are like, how did you come up with polar bear? It's so cute. I'm sure that alone sold a bunch of copies.
And that's an interesting thing. When people go, well, why did you, I've got the book. Why did you come up with this? It's like, most books have an about the cover on page 3. It's like, so why did you do that for this book I bought? Obviously, you haven't read the book I bought.
J'accused.
If you will buy it, you will see that there's nothing about the fact we just wanted to use a cute bear on the cover.
Yeah.
We just made something, I guess, that relates to the bear in a way. Or why did you choose that for the cover? Yeah.
I don't know. Why did you choose to use this technology? So there. All right. So you are the iOS tech lead at Get.
Correct. You can just think of it as transporting things from point A to point B, where things can be people or objects. That means you can do e-hailing for taxis, or you can also do deliveries, stuff like that. So that's why we call it generally a mobility company, because you can do a lot of things related to that field. And I've been there for about a year and a half now. I've been responsible for iOS-specific tech decisions, leading the team technically speaking, and doing a lot of hands-on work as well. It's been a ton of fun so far.
Great. And you're an iOS tech lead there.
Indeed. Yep.
But on the side, go ahead.
No, yes, I'm a tech lead there, and it's a bit of an abstract kind of role. I think it's really a good combination of being hands-on, but also providing really rich technical support and direction for the rest of the iOS team.
Mm-hmm. But on the side, you're also doing a lot of the open source work, especially in the RX Swift world.
Yeah, that's true. I think that my entire falling in love with reactive programming started from RX Swift. I started working with it a couple of years ago, I guess 2-3 years ago by now, and got really deep into it. I've been maintaining and I've been the owner of the Arc Swift community GitHub organization. I've been maintaining all of the projects there. And I've been doing a lot of work for the community. And over the past year, I've also been one of the main contributors of Arc Swift itself, along with Krunoslav Zahir, who wrote most of the code. But he's been kind enough to let me cooperate with him on maintaining that repo. So that's been a ton of fun as well and a huge challenge. And because in the company we highly leverage Arc Swift, it's also an awesome opportunity to, change the open source code of stuff you consume yourself inside the company in our architecture as well.
Okay. Now, how did you first come across the RX Swift project?
Wow, that's a really good question. I have
I try. I do.
Yeah, there's a reason you're on that side of the microphone, right? That's a really good question. I think that I used to work remotely for a U.S.-Canadian company on the mobile app of Tim Hortons, which is a Canadian coffee.
Yay, Timmy's.
Yes, Timmy. Exactly. So I used to work in the app there, and I had basically the permission to choose whatever tech stack I want and make whatever technological decisions I want when we started doing that project. And I used to hear a lot about reactive programming and how you can have a single source of truth for your state and make sure your app is always up to date. Don't have like stale states or, different values in different screens, different computations. And I thought it's really a cool concept, but I had no idea what it means. I just really dove into it. I took some risk and decided I'm going to try it on a few toy projects, try to figure it out. After a bunch of months of head bashing and trying to figure out how that thing works, today it's not the only way I would program, right? But it's something I understand very well, I think. And it's something that I feel fits most use cases, especially most asynchronous use cases. And an app is just a big asynchronous thing, right? Yep.
On the side, I've been trying to get into Canada, not get into Canada, but trying to get a job and move there. It would kill me to work remotely on Timmy's stuff because I know how I like the food from Tim Hortons, and to sit there going, I'm working remotely on this donut project.
Delicious. So delicious. I know. This is like an unpaid sponsorship for Timmy.
yeah, pretty much.
I mean, it was really hard. Like working remotely is really awesome. I did it for almost 3 years, and I used to fly every 2 or 3 months to New York for 2 or 3 weeks. So I spent about 2.5 months of every year in the office there. But actually, I developed the entire app without ever visiting Canada, which was pretty funny. A lot of good tests and a lot of good mock data. But yeah, it was funny because then eventually I did get to Canada and ordered. I was like, wow, this actually works. That's pretty funny.
I didn't think my app would actually work.
You didn't get to test your app until way after you were done?
I didn't, but obviously people in the company tested it. And but I didn't get to. I worked with a lot of mock data, so I tested it with that mock data, mock location, mock whatever, mock stores. But no, I didn't actually get the full experience of ordering, going to a store, taking the thing, making sure it actually works, that they start preparing the item on time. I never did until after it shipped, basically. Yeah.
That's an interesting. Can you imagine I'm just imagining testing an app where, I order from a store. So I go to the store, I put in the order, and then a teller or somebody is like, hey, how come my device just crashed? But I'd be like, ooh, looks like there's a bug.
Yeah, we really need to do a show on what it's like from an engineer's point of view to be a remote developer, because it's as my current position is remote as well. You get into the whole concept of meetings via sessions like this. You get into coding and how you monitor your own time. It's quite an endeavor. So
That's really, really good upside and downside, like anything else in life, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, Shai, I've got to ask you, we know what you do for work. We know what you do as sort of a hobby or as on the side with projects. What do you do when you're not coding?
Oh, okay. So I do a lot of things. I have a 7-month-old baby, so that's taking most of the time, basically.
Congratulations.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no, he's the sweetest. I would bring him into the camera, but he's far in the living room. But yeah, he's sweet, and it's funny actually. He went to talk at TriSwift in New York when he was maybe 5 weeks. Thanks to my wife for actually being on board with that. On board meaning not killing me, basically. The second thing I really like is I play guitar, electric guitar, bass, stuff like that. I have a bunch of, you can't see it on the camera, but a bunch of equipment surrounding me here. And I actually studied 2 years of music production and engineering, but
Oh, wow.
did end up doing high-tech work anyways. So
I have found that a lot of the guests that we've had on the show are either guitar or bass players. I don't know.
you or musicians in general, I actually have a theory that is becoming more practical that musicians are very passionate people about creating things, right?
Mm.
But music doesn't pay anything. So people go to a tech job where they can get money to sponsor the music thing, and then they realize they can actually have creative work when programming, so they devote themselves to that other thing now. So at least for me and some other friends that came from bands as well and switched to tech jobs, that's kind of the story, I think.
Yeah, I've always appreciated the art science crossover. I mean, my undergraduate was in theater, which a lot of people get a little confused about, or as a podcaster, people don't get confused about. But I decided that coding paid more than waiting tables. So
Definitely a good equation, I'd say. Oh yeah, another weird, not that weird hobby, I guess, but I'm really into coffee in a bit of an obsessed way. I have like a huge fancy coffee machine. I buy beans from every place I go to. Talk in a conference, I would always bring beans back home, like a fancy grinder and everything. I don't mean pour over coffee, like very popular in the US, but not popular here in Israel, actually. Just like espresso, cappuccino, stuff like that, really into that. And trying to get my latte art skills up to date. But yeah, you try that as well. I think that's another strong hobby of mine. To get caffeinated for work, right? You know?
I love it. Oh yeah, to prepare myself for all the coding. Do you, if you're like testing a new batch of beans, this is kind of embarrassing, but I've found that I can only really, when I drink a cup of coffee, it tastes like a cup of coffee to me. I can only really tell high quality versus low quality if I drink one after the other. Like if I quickly go from, Dunkin' Donuts coffee versus, fancy whatever coffee. Do you, does any of that remain once you get deep into that world? Or do you just immediately know, like you sip an espresso and you're like, garbage beans, amazing beans?
I think a lot of that is kind of magic words. And I don't think that that most people can really tell the difference, but basically it's like code, right? When you just start coding, you don't know the difference, and when you code for a couple of years, you have a good grasp of how good code looks like versus how bad code kind of looks like. So for me, yeah, it depends on how big the margin is, right? If it's really bad coffee and really good coffee, anyone would tell the difference, but in the higher levels, it's harder to notice. But definitely, for me, there is difference, even if not bad and good, just more this and less that. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense.
Well, we've got enough coffee to get us going. Where, what time is it in Israel right now?
It's 4:22 p.m. So when you said really early,
Yeah, it's early for the hosts who are on the East Coast. You're in Israel time, which is 4. We're about 9 this morning here, so a little more early for us. But we've got our coffee, and now it's time to get our Combine on. Combine is one of the new technologies that Apple dropped so lightly this past year. I mean, we've talked about the fact that WWDC sometimes can be underwhelming, and then came 2019 where they just pulled out a Gatling gun and started shooting the audience with technologies left and right. How do we best, from a 20,000-foot view, explain what Combine is?
I think that the best way, there are two there are two ways to describe it. I think that the theoretical, semi-theoretical way to describe it is just that it's a way to wrap asynchronous work. Today, when you do all sorts of asynchronous works, and that could be a tap on a button or calling a network request, you have different ways of representing these things. For example, a button tap could be some IB action, and a request could come back from a closure, but in Combine just have one way of representing all of these different things occurring over time. And the second thing is what people know as reactive programming. Because of these things, of these units representing asynchronous work, they can also push values that let you constantly get your app synchronized based on the latest state of these publisher objects. So you can subscribe to these objects and always get notified when there are changes, and that allows you to have your app always up to date and your app's UI always up to date based on that state.
And Combine only really has 3 objects, if I remember correctly. It's the publisher, the subscriber, and then and my mind goes blank, the
subscription
operator.
Oh, okay. So you have a couple of things. I guess if you count operators, because operators are also publishers, funnily enough, you have the publisher, which is the unit that actually publishes values to subscriber, which is the second unit, and that basically represents a consumer that gets these values from the publisher. And then you have a subscription, which is representing that's a specific connection between the two. Meaning, if I subscribe to the publisher, I get one subscription representing that connection. And when I'm done with it, I can just get rid of it and or deinitialize it, and that work is basically canceled. And operators are just a really cool way to manipulate these values that come from these publishers. And there are a lot of them. For example, you can use something like retry and get really complex retrying logic for free without writing a single extra line of code. And because publisher is a single interface, you can do that retry on a network request exactly like you can do it on a video decoding session. So basically anything asynchronous can use all of these operators, which is really, really useful and cool, basically.
So what is the best approach to, I mean, besides go buy a book, your book, what is the best approach to begin to wrap your head around the way that Combine is put together?
Not buying the book. No, I'm kidding. Okay, the book yeah, I had to. Yeah. No, I'm kidding. The book is really good to get up to speed on all the components that Combine has to offer, theoretically speaking, and also practically speaking. But to actually apply it means actually building things with it and experimenting with it and seeing what works for your specific use cases. So you need, I guess, like I said earlier about RxSwift, right? You have these observable, which is like a publisher in Combine, and you know what it does, but you don't necessarily know how to apply it to your work yet. And the best way to know is to start working on apps that actually use that and be like, oh, okay, so I have a publisher, and you can update me when things change. So maybe instead of using Notification Center, I'm going to use a publisher that emits notification changes. Or maybe instead of waiting for a delegate callback, I'm going to use a publisher to do that. Oh, and now I have 2 publishers. I can actually combine them together instead of having a callback and a delegate and trying to figure out how to put the 2 things together. And then as you acquire more knowledge of these things, you realize that everything is asynchronous work. And if you put all of these different asynchronous pieces under that same interface, you can easily connect them and make really complex and pretty beautiful logic with them as well, in my opinion. Yeah. And then you have the matter of taste thing, which is architectures. That's an entirely different heavy talk. A lot of full of a lot of fancy buzzwords that are overloaded with different architectures. But
yeah, I remember one of the demos they gave, which was surprisingly over on the Swift UI side, was showing how they could use Combine to have 3 different text fields and a switch or something to make sure that the text fields were all filled out and the switch was thrown before a submit button would light up.
Exactly. So I think that's a really good, it's a basic example. It's a good example to show how quickly you can get started in taking these different pieces of information floating in the air and making sense of them in a contained environment and putting them together. You also mentioned that in 2019, we got a bunch of interesting content together, which is something Apple doesn't really do. I've been to Dub 2016 and 2018. I was like, that was really nice. 2018 was a bit of a slow year. And then, of course, I missed 2019 when they had all the good stuff out. And I think, a lot of people were kind of wondering why they released Swift UI so early in a way, because it was not entirely baked when they released it. And I think it's just because Swift UI and Combine live together. They work off each other. More specifically, Swift UI needs Combine to live. So they had to push these things together, I think. I think Swift UI, some people, they don't know Combine under the hood, and basically every time your Swift UI app redraws itself, it's because there's some publisher behind the scenes that tells it to do that.
Oh, that's interesting. So do you think to like make use of Swift UI, people will need to use Combine, or is it just powered under the hood by Combine?
I think they would need to understand it. I think that a lot of the very basic units, which are like observable object, published, all these things use Combine publishers under the hood, and you can easily build a very basic Swift UI app, or even not so basic, without knowing what Combine is and what it does. But the more you know, the better, right? So if you know how these things work under the hood, then when you get into some edge case, you know how to solve it very easily. Or if you think, should I really use Combine? My app doesn't use Combine at all at this point. You can say, no, my app actually uses a ton of Combine at this point. So it does make sense to actually leverage these technologies, because the rest of my app is already leveraging it, basically.
Cool.
Now, we talked to Laurie Gray 2 shows ago about Swift UI, and we all basically agreed that Swift UI was changing during the beta process. It's probably going to have some changes over the next year. You also used the term not completely baked.
Yeah.
However, with Combine, that one seemed rather rock solid when it came out. Would you agree that one's got a good baking and it's really something that can be built on right now?
I think that Combine is much more ready than Swift UI. I think because it's not as much as a user-facing thing like Swift UI. So you had a bunch of really smart people working on Swift UI and Combine, obviously, and making sure that is ready. And I think that, obviously Swift UI is the sexier technology, quote unquote, because a lot of people work with it because it will eventually become the new way to build apps. Much like Swift became the new language to develop apps with, and people, a lot of people use Objective-C, but not a lot of people start building iOS apps with Objective-C these days, which makes sense, right? It's the new tech. I do think that, again, they might have released it a bit too early because, as you said, even things like the object did change versus object will change, like that a big difference they made maybe a couple of weeks before going on Xcode Gold Master. That's very unlike Apple to make such a big change, close to release. But, eventually they did a really good job. I think that all the people I know that worked with Swift UI would agree that it works really well for most cases. It kind of allows you to draw really big brush strokes, still hard to get the small details right, I think. But it's evolving, right? So to your question, going back to it, I think Combine, I guess, is 85 or 90% feature complete. There are some missing pieces for people coming from Reactive Swift or Arc Swift, but it's definitely there. They definitely have most of the concepts down. There are some differences that are quite big that some people are having a hard time to grasp, but aside from that, I think it's a really well-built framework.
Do you feel it's easier for people to get into Combine if they were or were not familiar with RX Swift? You said there were a lot of big differences that people are having difficulty getting over. It almost sounds like if you haven't touched RX Swift, maybe you'll have a slightly easier time getting into Combine.
No, actually, I definitely think that if you did RX Swift or Reactive Swift work before, then Combine is going to be super easy for you. Okay. There are two big differences. I guess one huge difference, which is called back pressure, which is something that they added in Combine. We also have it in RX Java, but we never had it in a Swift-based reactive library.
Oh,
Reactive
that's interesting.
Swift, either Reactive Swift or RX Swift don't have it. So back pressure is basically a mechanism to define what to do when there is a burst of too many values being shot at the subscriber at one time. For example, someone subscribes and the publisher immediately has 10,000 values, and the subscriber has no idea what to do with so many pieces of information. So instead, in Combine, the publisher doesn't actually push any data until the subscriber says, give me some values. Subscriber can say, give me up to 3 values, or give me unlimited values, or give me no values. So that's a really big change in perception. And I also, to this point, I think it's not a good decision because it makes building custom publishers and stuff like that much more complicated. And the cases for actually using back pressure are very, very limited, in my opinion, especially in UI-based apps. But it is what Apple chose to do. I think they built Combine as this sort of framework does react like declarative programming, and not necessarily aimed it at UI-based apps, which makes sense, right? And the second thing is that there are typed errors, which is something that Reactive Swift has, but Arc Swift never had. So that's also a big hop to some people. But definitely the back pressure thing is a huge change to people trying to build custom stuff.
So can you customize that? Like if you, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but in Arc's Java land, there's a specific type where you can kind of manage back pressure, and you can say buffer all of it, or drop flowables. Yeah, like drop all of this stuff or whatever. Can you do any of that customization in Combine?
Nope. Unfortunately,
I like a nice succinct answer. Nope.
You cannot, and I think that's a huge. That's what I mentioned to be. I think wrong. I think they made a wrong decision on this, because today the contract of a publisher means that you are forced to respect back pressure demand, they call it, right? But maybe I don't need back pressure. And because every publisher is forced to adhere to that contract, it means that making these custom ones is very, very hard. Very hard to grasp. And I think having a different type, even like flowable in for Arcs Java versus observable in Arcs Java, would provide much better value. And I also think you wouldn't be surprised that most people would use observable and not touch flowable, actually, because it's I think it provides very rare use cases, some use. I might be wrong, but that's my experience on it, of course.
The use cases where the back pressure is a problem, are we talking streams of data from maybe a storage area, or what other kind of use cases can cause this problem?
I guess back pressure, it's very common for sensor information. Like if you move your mouse across the screen, you're going to get a burst of points. Or if you swipe your finger across the screen, you're going to get a bunch of UI touch, like a set of UI touch events. That could be thousands of events if the user does kind of swipes the screen back and forth. Same thing for huge portions of analytical data, stuff like that. It's hard for me to, give you good examples off the top of my head exactly because it is not very common that you would run into it. And there are actually operators that let you, in Arc Swift, people develop very complex systems without back pressure because there are operators that already sort of take care of these things. So again, it was just, I guess, a design choice on the Combine team, on the Combine framework team, but it is their choice. I don't think it was a good choice, but I'm not part of that team, and I think it's a good technology in general. I think that specifically is a choice that makes consuming that framework harder.
And we'll have more with Shai in our talk about Combine after this message from Springboard. This episode of the RayWenderlich.com podcast is sponsored by Springboard. If you want hands-on experience in deploying a machine learning model, want to learn how to write machine learning algorithms, or would like to deploy a deep learning prototype, check out Springboard's Machine Learning Engineering Career Track.
With this program, you'll also be paired with a machine learning expert who provides one-on-one mentorship support throughout the entire course. This was designed for software engineers, so you must have at least 1 year of experience coding with an object-oriented programming language to be eligible. Springboard is the first company and still the only company in the US to offer a machine learning engineering career guarantee for students interested in changing careers. This means either you get a job in the industry or you get your tuition reimbursed if you're based in the US or Canada.
The RayWenderlich.com podcast has partnered with Springboard to exclusively offer a $500 scholarship to the first 20 eligible applicants. Scholarships are awarded on a first-come, first-served basis, and remember to use the code AI Springboard when you apply. To see if you're eligible, go to springboard.com. The application is free and only takes 10 minutes. And we thank Springboard for sponsoring this episode of the Ray Wenderlich Podcast. One of the questions that I love to ask is, assuming that the podcast has Apple engineers listening, what is your wish list? What is missing, or how would you wish an extension of Combine? Now, obviously, you're not going to fundamentally change it.
Of course.
But what is your personal wish list for, say, a Combine 2?
Yeah, I got two things on that one. I think a big missing operator is with latest from, and also stuff like we get from Arcs Cocoa, which is Cocoa-specific publishers, for example. So you can subscribe to Touch Event or subscribe to text changes on a UI text field. So those are things that we don't really have in Combine today, but we have in other frameworks. And the second thing, which isn't really a wishlist item, but I guess just something I wish they would do earlier, I think that because Combine was built on the reactive streams kind of definition and also took some inspiration for sure from Arc Swift and Reactive Swift, I think it would be awesome if they would involve the community. The community would love to help. I think even if they would want to hire people working on these projects, they would probably be happy to work on something so monumental, such as bringing reactive programming into iOS without third-party dependency. So if they would, I don't know if he would accept, right? But if they would offer Kronoslav a job, or the main people working on Reactive Swift, and having all of these people working on Combine, it would be amazing, I'm sure.
Because as we point out, Darwin is open source and Swift is open source, but Combine itself is proprietary to Apple.
Right. We also have, Foundation Libs that's also open source. You have a lot of, actually, Apple is doing really awesome work moving some things to open source, like Argument Parser. They just released a couple of days ago, but entire frameworks are not on that list. As you said, you have libdispatch and stuff that's in old open source archives. I think it's a shame because it also means Combine can't be used under Linux today, which is really a shame. The other frameworks do let you do that. Like you can use Reactive Swift or Arc Swift in a Linux server with Vapor or whatever if you want to do that. I kind of hope they would change that. I don't think they would make it open source, but maybe they would add Linux support at some point. That would also be pretty cool.
Again, that's something that we'll have to wait and see for Definitely. Material that would be released with WWDC 20.
I'm looking to see how much work I would have on the second edition of the book. Hoping a lot and not so much at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always and again, we hope that none of these technologies do a Swift 2 to Swift 3 transition. Yeah, because that was a growth spurt like most teenagers have.
That was rough, but I can't say I'll be totally surprised if Swift UI has that change at some point. I mean, it is in its primal state, and I think they can easily kind of say, okay, we took some community feedback, and we now think that the interface should change to something completely different. And that completely different thing would be awesome, but it would require a lot of refactors. I mean, I think it's fine to do that. It's very, very early in the lifetime of Swift UI and Combine as well.
All right, so let's dive down a little into publishers and subscribers and the general subscription. My understanding is the publisher itself basically just has the two types, which is the data type and the error type. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. You have two associated generic types, which would be the output, which is the kind of values that publisher can send, and the failure, which, as I said earlier, is the typed error. So if you have a specific error type, you have a guarantee that this publisher can only fail with that specific error type, which is pretty useful, actually. But it's also limiting because when you want to compose a lot of publishers together, you have to match all of their error types together, which is a bit painful. Yeah, exactly. So if you have a failed network request and a failed image decoding session, you somehow have to create an intermediary error type that unifies them together. So we got generics, but we are having some pain with specialization in a way.
Mm-hmm. Right, because the operator in there is somehow transforming the networking. Well, I would assume that if the networking is to pull down an image request, that your image error is either going to be network problem.
Yeah.
So any network error turns into just one error along the way.
Exactly. So that's what you would usually do. You would find a way either in the upper stages, meaning you could say an image decoding error is of the type of an API error, and we would just add another case to that error. But it also could be that you're doing something in a third party and in your own code, and these things emit different kind of errors. So we'd have to unify them somehow. I think, it's not a huge issue, but it is some issue, because if you, and you have to do it because if you combine two publishers, then what is the error type, right? You have to define that somehow, because the generic system doesn't know how to infer that for you.
Do you end up with a lot of like top level enum errors that is like, this error could be API error or image decoding error or touch event error? Basically,
yeah. I mean, that's actually a really good example. If you do like a URL session, data task publisher, which is like data task with a closure, but you get a publisher instead, you would get some URL session error. But if you use the decode operator, which decodes the data, you would get a decoding error. So now you have two kind of error types that can be thrown here. And that means that the eventual error type would just be a plain Swift error. So instead, you have to kind of catch all of these errors and use something called map error to map all of these different error types into a singular error type. So yeah, I mean, typed errors are cool, but they have some drawbacks in the compositional kind of aspect.
And errors themselves can be more than just an error code. They can be an error code and a data packet as well. If you're
basically anything that
errors can be anything you build out of them.
Yeah, anything that conforms to the Swift error protocol basically can be an error. It can be most commonly in enum with some cases that and even associated values, or even a full struct with some information. Like Swift doesn't care as long as you conform to the right protocol.
If you get 3 or 4 different error types, instead of combining them, just send never back.
Exactly. So that's actually a good segue into the fact that you have you can set the failure to never, and that's a guarantee that that publisher would never emit any error. It can never fail. Cool. It's really useful for UI stuff, actually.
Because the UI is going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, if you have value feeding a text field, you have nothing to do with an error, right? You want to feed the text field, so you're going to catch the error and give some other fallback value instead, and that would guarantee that you would get a never failure, because instead of an error, you switch it with the output type of that publisher.
Now, under the hood, most of Combine is protocol-based, so it was very gluable. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it is quite composable. There aren't too many protocols. I think that you usually end up, as long as you don't do custom work, right? Custom work means if you want to build an entirely custom publisher or entirely custom operator without composing other ones, then you wouldn't usually work with the lower protocols. They are there to let you do custom work if you want to do that. But as I said, because of back pressure and other constraints, it is quite difficult to get that exactly right. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I wouldn't say that like Combine is a protocol-oriented framework or something. Mm-hmm. It's more around, I mean, it is from the sense that you have to match the output and the input and all these different generic constraints. But yeah, I would say it's basically just a system to allow you to represent work in a really single way, so that you don't have to figure out how you're going to do that specific kind of work. Just define one way to do work. And that's the way you represent it across your entire app, or across whatever portion of your app that you choose to apply Combine in.
The gluable I mentioned was more directed toward the way that Combine has now been attached to the foundation classes, and things like the timers and the notifications. Yeah. They've not changed. You've still got your notifications, you've still got your timers, but now that they're, I guess the best way is to say they're Combine aware.
Yeah, I think that basically they just added Combine capabilities to these foundation frameworks, right? So you can take a sequence, an array, dictionary, whatever, and do .publisher, and you get a publisher emitting the values in the array. Or you can do, as you said, timer.publish. But all these basically do is just return a new publisher. It's not really a protocol. It's an actual concrete type of publisher that only does that specific thing. But I think, as you said, they just added another layer of publisher-based capabilities on top of the foundation APIs, like in URL session, which I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I wasn't aware until I'd gone through the book that arrays had become capable of becoming publishers.
Yeah, it's quite useful for figuring out how to do something, I think. It's useful for mock data, stuff like that, or for the book is actually a really good case. You can just mock an array of people structs or whatever and immediately make a publisher out of it that would fire through your entire operator chain, and that's quite useful.
So you effectively have it. Is it basically, if it's an array of string, it's basically a string never?
Exactly. You got this. You already know Combine.
Oh, no, I'll tell you, I'm on chapter 2, so no.
That's good. You got through the introduction. That's
one of the things that really surprised me at WWDC, and I talked about this on Swift UI, was that Combine was basically demonstrated by itself almost in a bubble. Mm-hmm. That they didn't do a lot of showing you how to make it part of an app.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I think that also for the talks I do, that's really, really hard to do. Not because you don't have really good use cases to do it. I actually started doing the things at the end of my talk. I usually raffle 2 copies of the book, and I build a raffle using Combine. And I think it's a really nice way to present how to use it, but it's not what I would necessarily do in a production app because, as we talked earlier, as we said earlier, architectures are really, really opinionated. So Apple can't come out and say, this is how you should use Combine. They can only say, this is what Combine does, and now you have a bunch of architectures you can sort of leverage that in. And also, even if there was an architecture, it's actually super hard to, in a 30-minute or 50-minute talk to explain such a complex topic and talk about the actual practical implications of it. I don't do it as well. Even when I used to do 50-minute long Arc Swift talks, I usually didn't do a lot of in practice because that's actually a completely different session, in my opinion. I wish they would do an in practice session in 2020.
Yeah, unfortunately, and we'll get. Never mind. The book itself does give a sort of a practical application example in the second half, if I remember correctly. Is it a newsreader?
There are a couple of good applications written by the team. There is a Hacker News reader kind of app. There is also a photo collage picker, and also I think the end chapter would have Chuck Norris jokes app, Swift UI app, based on Combine Publisher.
The important stuff.
I know. We only have the most important and critical apps in our book. So yeah, I think Scott worked on that last one, and Maureen Todorov worked on the other 2 chapters. All of them did a really cool job. I think that it is different, though, than if you are a company that has 80 screens or whatever that has a really huge and complex architecture. You would usually not use something out of a book that works on 1 or 2 screens. You would use some of the basic techniques, but eventually the book only provides you a really, really solid foundation that basically we don't get from Apple's documentation at this point to start investigating and exploring these capabilities in your own code base and in your own architectural decisions. That's all we can offer, I guess, from a book.
I don't know. I'm actually looking forward to getting to the chapters on the Hacker Newsreader predominantly because I wrote a newsreader for a company.
Nice.
And this was back in the Objective-C days. Mm-hmm. So I am especially looking forward to seeing how in Swift with Combine that's going to fit together.
I think they're really, really good chapters, and I think that for the sample apps that they made for the book, they built them really, really well. I was just specifically speaking about, production grade apps that have dozens and dozens of screens. Maybe those techniques that were portrayed on 2 screens probably won't fit as well. But definitely the concepts would, right? Eventually, we teach concepts. We don't teach this is how you should do things without any thought process, right? We just want to show with thought process of building these simpler apps so you can compose them into bigger apps in your own time eventually.
So now to put you on the spot, which architectures do you find yourself drifting toward or using, or is it still pretty much the right tool for right job? That combine wise?
Yeah, I'm gonna go and take the diplomatic approach. No, I'm just joking. I'm
gonna offend people left and right now.
I still think that it is a right tool for the right job, definitely, because if you have a three-piece app, maybe you don't need an architecture, right? Maybe you just need some publishers to get the job done. They're also, workable for those who like them. For sure.
That was nice and diplomatic.
That was actually really not a nice thing to say. Workable for those who like them. That's kind of whatever serves the purpose of building the app, right? Eventually, only the developer and the team knows what works best for their development process.
Now, with Combine and SwiftUI, you don't need to convert your entire app. You can take it piecemeal, and you can update only a few things at a time. And the RX Swift is also out there, and it's got a bit of a following as well. Are these, for lack of a better word, combinable? Can you have part of your app using pieces of RX Swift, part of your app using Combine?
I'll start from the TLDR of this. Yes, you definitely can. I think it could also become popular once teams try to transition from RX Swift to Combine, and that would happen when teams' minimal deployment target is going to be iOS 13, which is the minimal deployment target of Combine as well. So I would say that for production teams, 2-3 years ahead, right? So even today, there's an open source project I worked on called RX Combine that lets you convert observables into publishers. And I think that is a really good way to start putting the two together. So you would say, I'm not going to go over 2 years of work and turn everything into publisher, but if I need a publisher here, I can just convert it and connect it to my new pieces of code working with Combine. So definitely there's a technical way to do that for sure.
Is RX Combine another open source project?
Yeah, it's an open source project I worked on, and it's now part of Combine Community, which is the GitHub organization we do a lot of the open source work in. And it's also online on combine.community, which is an actual domain, which is so awesome. So happy to get that one. Yeah.
I've been happy ever since TLDs went away, and we've now got much more descriptives for what things are. The .com hijack wars seem to be over there.
Yeah, there's still some hijacks over some of the, if you try to get a .dev or .design, you probably have to fight your way through getting the good names, but
yeah,
for sure.
What's the other major one? .io is another huge...
very techy kind of TLD.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's because we saw it coming and we all dove on them.
For sure.
In RX Java, there's a bunch of... There's observables, which are kind of the main type, and then there's little sort of offshoots of them, like completables and singles to represent, this is just one value, or this has no values. Does Combine have any sort of analogous thing there?
Combine doesn't yet. RX Swift has single completable and maybe. That's the name of they're called traits in RX Swift. So that's part of the reason I say Combine is 85-90% complete, because they still build all these tiny pieces. I'm not sure if they will, but I think those are missing in a way, because they provide type safe guarantees. Like single provides you a guarantee that you only get a single value. Combine has something called future that kind of offers the same thing with some differences. But for completable and maybe, you don't really have parallels yet. Something that's strange about future in Combine is that it's not lazy; it's eager. So as soon as you initialize a future, it already starts doing the work. You don't subscribe to it; it already starts doing it. And when you subscribe, you just get a replay of the last cached result, which is a bit confusing to people coming from other frameworks. But it's a good detail to know.
It's kind of like a promise in JavaScript or promise kit world, where it's just going.
Yeah, exactly. Because you also don't have the notion, I think, that Swift has as when you talk about type safety and stuff like that. But I think that when we come from reactive frameworks and not promises and stuff like that, we have the expectation that only when we subscribe the work starts. So when I saw that and I bumped into it while working on the book, it was quite a surprise to me, and we put it in the book as a note because people, I believe, would definitely fall for that one. I already saw a couple of people expecting it to be lazy, so it's quite confusing for sure.
That's interesting. I wonder why they did that. Another thing, so in Android world, a lot of people use RxJava really just because it has really good threading capabilities built in there. Does Combine, do you deal with threads or dispatchers or anything like that in the Combine world?
RxJava and RxSwift both use schedulers, and that same concept is in Combine as well. So in Combine, you can perform work on a specific scheduler or choose to receive the values on a specific scheduler, exactly like in RxJava and RxSwift. You can use run loops for that. You can use a dispatch queue. You can use threads. So it's actually pretty flexible. I found it to be a bit iffy. I mean, I found it I find it not always to be reliable. It has some tiny bugs, but mostly it works really well, as you would expect it to in other frameworks. So yeah, you get the same capabilities, I'd say.
Cool. Well, that's awesome. I think my last question is, why do you think Apple came out with Combine when RxSwift was there, when Reactive Swift was there? What was their impetus to make another one and to pull it into the platform instead of just encouraging people to use whatever the analogous third-party library is? Or maybe that's just not the Apple way. Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely not the Apple way, unfortunately, to use community projects or give credit a bit to community projects. I'm not saying that they took the entire framework from existing open source stuff, but they could mention that some of even the operator names and even some of the design decisions were sort of inspired by Reactive Swift or RxSwift, and we saw that in the community. Even as we were kind of watching the State of the Union and things like that, people were messaging me, did you see what they did? I was like, why are you mad? It's actually really awesome. I mean, this is Apple's way of recognizing that reactive programming, declarative programming is something they think is awesome, and they want to pay developers money to make this framework and constantly make sure it's supported and updated. I don't think it would kill RxSwift at all. I think RxSwift is such an awesome framework, and also Reactive Swift, really, really smart people working on both of these projects. And we are years ahead of being able to use this stuff in production unless you are working on a cutting-edge technology or a company that doesn't care losing 20% of their users or whatever. But I think also that a big selling point, there are two more points to why they did it, I think. One would have to be Swift UI, right? I mean, it provides the foundations to how it re-renders all of its components. They could probably get away with making a small variation of it inside Swift UI, but I think they just chose to make a general use framework for declarative programming.
That makes sense.
Quite smart. And the second thing I think is that there is a big selling point now to reactive programming. I think that a lot of the people who were dissing RxSwift and Reactive Swift on Twitter and Slack, not liking these...
The most important people.
Exactly. I mean, all these people that really were bashing these sort of frameworks now are fans because it's built into the ecosystem. You don't have to import a third-party library, and it's a huge issue for some people, but it's also because Apple sort of gave it their stamp that it's a valid development technique, and now people actually give it a chance and try to learn it, which is awesome for all frameworks involved in that area, I think.
Do you think
that's a good point?
Do you think that the Combine lagged a year or two just because it was waiting on the Swift ABIs?
Wow, I have no idea. My only guess is that Swift UI came a year early. I'm not sure Combine came a year early. I mean,
I meant Combine, not Swift UI.
No, I know. I think that my guess is that they did plan to release Combine and maybe Swift UI the year later and be like, oh, that's why we built Combine, to support this UI framework. But eventually, I think they released it the same because there are I mean, it's hard to say, right? I think it's mainly business reasons. I'm not sure if it's technical reasons, because you saw the amount of pressure before the release and how many things were not entirely ready. So maybe it's just, the competition around, Elm-based, your UI is a function of your state kind of frameworks or whatever. Or maybe they just wanted to have a really packed dub. I mean, I don't know the Apple way of thinking. You can only guess, basically. I have no idea.
That's true.
I like that idea that they released Swift UI and Combine in the year. Not because they wanted those frameworks to come out, but they just wanted to have an exciting WWDC.
Just want a bunch of content in W. Yeah, for sure.
Throw away the stuff a year later. But that was a good WWDC.
We made a conference kit for all your conferences. You don't need it, but we want that conference.
Having attended many WWDCs, I think 19 was my 16th year.
Wow.
I don't think there's ever been a meter on how good or bad the presentations need to be. Well, not the presentations, but the overall technology dump. Because there have been years where it's effectively been, so we did all these changes last year. Let's refine those and do classes on specifically talking about last year's technologies, and they'll have one new thing that'll get people's attention. I think that, this was the year that it came out, just because this was the year that this stuff all came out. It just was a lot of it all at once.
Could be. I mean, as I said, we can only guess.
Yeah, it's true.
I think that even more so, there are a lot of really good pieces of enhancements that they just don't show in DubDub. They have the big screen with all the small text that show what's new in iOS, and then you kind of screenshot it, and they were like, "Oh, this is awesome," and they never even talk about it.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. I always screenshot those because I'm always looking at the stuff in the fine print.
Exactly, it's easy. It's just more exploration. Even like the UI table view diffing thing. Like the diffable data source, so cool, and they barely mentioned it. Such a cool API. There are a lot of really good things that we got in iOS 13. We got a lot of nice things for sure.
Which I guess we should mention that we talked earlier in the season about the fact that we do live casts of Google I/O and WWDC, and for those of listening to this years later after the live period, we're dealing with COVID-19 and the coronavirus, and it's really beginning to shut down a lot of these major conferences. There's a website, isitcanceledYet.com, which is basically a list of all the major tech conferences for 2020 and whether or not they have been canceled. South by Southwest has been canceled, not a major tech conference. Shai, you were mentioning a few of the ones that you heard were canceled.
I was supposed to talk in Tokyo in Tri-Swift, which was just a lifelong dream of me to fly there, and it was canceled because the outbreak in Japan, and a couple of days ago, AppDevCon in Netherlands was canceled as well.
Google I/O has now been officially canceled. That doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be a Google I/O technology dump at about the same time period. Obviously, we'll do a semi-live cast from whenever that data dump comes. But it's been an interesting year for tech because these conferences are not going to be happening this year. Especially the major ones from these companies like Amazon, like Facebook, like Twitter. These cons are all being shut down just due to the general concern of packing that many people during a period of time where we have a very affluent virus going around.
It's quite crazy. I mean, actually, the situation in Israel as well right now, all of a sudden, just like a boom in people coming back from Italy or back from Japan or whatever, and infecting local residents. So it's pretty terrifying here as well, exactly like it is in many other countries in the world. Like Italy, from 3 people to a lot, and some dead people in France as well. I mean, it's just insane. I really hope we'll hear the end of that one soon.
Yeah, and Israel, as compared to something like the United States, that's a very small country. So the ability to infect that entire country will probably be a lot faster than the United States, which has had its share of not a very large number, but a number of deaths have occurred. So obviously, the other side effect of all of this is that a lot of tech engineers are being told, no, just work from home.
Work remotely, yeah.
Work remotely, and even if they have been office folks, the company that I'm working remotely for has issued an edict to its on-site employees saying, if you got a cough, just don't come in.
Yeah.
Stay home and work remotely, and I think that's very intelligent. The question will be, of course, whether or not engineers will find themselves working remotely and then not going back to the office as such.
For sure. I think also that what you said about Israel, the upside of being a small country is that we also have very specific entryways, so we can just shut down the main airport and there is no way to get in or out of the country, basically, because all of our borders are with tricky countries, you would say. So you would need to get on an airplane to go to Europe or the US or wherever. And
what about water? Isn't there
what do you mean? I mean, it's not a common thing to go on a boat to a different country. I mean, you could go maybe to Greece or something like that, but that country also is quite infected at this point. So I think a lot of Israelis, and I think all over the world, you see this already kind of stock up on a lot of canned goods, water, stuff like that. It's a bit paranoid, but also, I can relate to how scary it is from my point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Having my beginning family, yeah, exactly.
And I don't want to turn the end of this podcast into a series of gloom and doom. I just want to stress that we're very lucky that this season is only 2 weeks between when we record an episode to when we actually have that episode go out. So as these conferences may get canceled or there may be changes to these conferences, we can at least get that information out to our listeners to say, okay, this one is gone, or I should follow up with that.
Right.
And we'll still have all the tech that comes available as it comes.
For
Shai,
sure.
There's been so much good information that you've given us today on Combine. I think that it's definitely a technology that people should be taking a look into and looking at how the adoption can work, and not just Combine, but the reactive technologies for both iOS and Android have just climbed out of the dark, and really maybe Apple did succeed in throwing a huge spotlight on reactive technologies this past year.
Yeah,
Shai, I really want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been tons of fun.
Yeah, hope to do this again sometime. Thanks for inviting me. I wanted to do a quick sentence on, but tell me if it makes sense because we already said our goodbyes.
We can edit.
But when you said like Android and iOS, it kind of reminded me of another good, like the point here when we were talking about RX Java and RX, and I'm an iOS developer, we can still talk in the same terms, and I think that's also a huge selling point of these concepts, that we have an iOS and Android team obviously working on the same products, and we can guide each other, ask each other questions, consult on how to build these different features because it all uses the same techniques. So that's just another really good way of sort of having sort of even I guess team-wide architecture, but it's not an architecture, but a team-wide technology.
Or a language.
Everyone, exactly, just a team-wide language, like operators are a language, right? When I say retry, flat map, the Java team knows exactly what it means, and you can't say that about many other technologies for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found when I went a long time doing Android using RX Java, and I jumped into an iOS project, and it was amazing how little effort it took to start using RX Swift in that case. It was all the exact same stuff. I mean, how I do something in RX Java is exactly how I'll do it in RX Swift. So that I think is huge and awesome.
All right, I'm going to actually back up and do the out one more time because there was a couple of things I forgot to say, and I'm going to add those in. So
perfect.
Shai, this is really great information. I think Combine is a technology that people should definitely be looking into and adopting in iOS using reactive. It's great to see Apple throwing a spotlight on reactive technologies. It's going to help both the iOS and the Android world. Combine, of course, we didn't even talk about the fact that that technology and that framework is for the entire Apple stack. You can do it for the Mac. You can do it for the watch, the TV. Shai, author of the book Combine Asynchronous Programming with Swift. You can find him online at Twitter for Freak4PC. That's Freak, the number 4, and PC. Shai, thank you again for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, and sorry for being a freak for PC and not a freak for Mac, but it's a 15-year-old name, so you'll have I hope it won't make you not.
We'll hold it against you.
Like I said, I've got the 6-color bleeding shirt here, so I've always been a fan.
ultimate fanboy. Yeah.
Let's see, Alex, do you want to talk about our next episode in 2 weeks?
Yes, absolutely. So on our next episode, Philippe Babic is going to come in and talk about Kotlin coroutines. We're kind of going to continue the thread of asynchronousness and figure out what's changing in the Kotlin world around doing asynchronous actions. So that'll be a very fun one.
So this basically means that you can listen to this episode and the next episode at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. Both one ear, you'll have one button one ear, one button another ear, and you'll get everything, I'm sure. Or a lot of race conditions about what you hear.
Exactly.
I'll bring my semaphores with me.
We got deadlock.
I feel a deadlock in your future.
Oh, this is going to get really, really bad really fast, so we're going to just turn up the music and send things back to Ray. Ray, back to you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave a rating on iTunes. See you next time.